Good evening. The Indian economy is in the news again, and it's not good news. The former chief economic advisor to the Modi government between 2014 and 2018 has written a paper in Harvard, where he is now based, stating that India has grossly overestimated our GDP growth. Now, he estimates that our GDP growth hasn't in fact been growing at an average of 7% over the last decade or so. Instead, it has been growing at 4.5% between 2011 and 2017. Now, interestingly, he says it's not the politicians but the bureaucrats who've made the error. And since the error was made over the terms of UPA 2 and NDA 1, no one is to be blamed. Even more interesting is that he suggests that these inflated phantom numbers, in fact, are the ones that led to the complacency on the part of the Modi government in its first term. And if they had accurate numbers, they'd perhaps done a better job with the economy. Now, we could start a political blame game, but that would go on for weeks, and we don't have weeks. We don't have any time at all. The other data that came out today were the car sales numbers, and they are downright depressing. Car sales are down 20% in May. Two-wheeler sales have dipped about 7%, and commercial vehicles are down 8% in sales. Now, you might ask why car sales are important. Well, because they're an indicator of how confident the citizen is. A confident household that thinks it's doing well will buy a new vehicle. Also, the government, you'll remember, has constantly used car sales to rubbish claims of slowdowns in the past. Couple the car sales numbers with the fact that air passenger numbers are dropping. Air passenger traffic is down 4.5% for the first time in 5 years. And this shows that people don't want to spend money if they can avoid it. Now, in economic terms, that means discretionary spending is down. But never mind the discretionary spending or the spending that you can avoid. Let's talk about the spending that you shouldn't be avoiding. Basic things like soap, especially in the summer. In fact, ask anyone in a Mumbai local and they'll tell you, they'll swear that people have stopped using soap. But that's not an economic indicator. Hindustan Lever, the biggest soap manufacturer in the country, is an economic indicator. And it has shown a drop in the volume of its sales. Its sales are down 7% in volume for a company that would normally have shown double-digit growth for all the previous quarters. Bank credit is down, which means businesses are not borrowing, so they're not growing. Oil demand is the lowest in 5 years, so people are not traveling in India. Unemployment, based on the government's own data, is at a 45-year high. Where does that leave us, really? Remember how the government insisted that everything was perfect and fantastic and rosy with our economy during the elections? Is this the bill we are now paying? Has the denial wasted precious time? And are we now in deep, deep trouble? That's the question we are asking today. And as far as Mr. Arvind Subramanian's response paper is concerned, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation has issued a clarification to his regard of overestimation. They've basically said that the centre's data is scientific, is derived using internationally accepted statistical tools and standards. Effectively, they have put out another denial. Can we afford to have a government that is constantly denying evidence? And is it this denial of evidence that has got us to this point? Is it already too late? That's the question we're asking this evening. On the conversation with me, Professor Arun Kumar is the chair professor at the International Institute of Social Sciences. Forgive me. Also, we have Manisha Priyam, who's a political analyst, Jayati Ghosh, professor of economics at JNU, Shweta Shalini for the BJP, R. Nagraj is a professor at the IGIDR, and Santosh Mehrotra, professor of economics at the Center for Informal Sector and Labour Studies. I welcome all of you to this conversation. Thank you for joining us. I will start with Jayati Ghosh. Ms. Ghosh, good evening, and thank you for joining us. Do you, again, I'm going to ask you, perhaps for the 6th time in the last quarter, do you find Arvind Subramanian's paper interesting? Does 4.5% seem closer to the truth to you?
Yes, it does. But I mean, basically, look, there are two issues here. There's the medium-term issue, which is what Arvind Subramanian's paper is concerned with. And there is the more recent data and trends that you have just mentioned. Now, in fact, what Professor Subramanian has done is raised concerns that many of us have expressed from when the new series data were released. And essentially, a lot of those revolved around how you calculate industrial growth, particularly the use of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs data. And many of us had argued that those data in particular are not necessarily representative of the whole of industry, that they are replete with all kinds of issues because you're just using company balance sheets, which are often window dressed for various reasons, and also that it assumes a constant relationship between the formal and the informal sectors of the economy, which we know need not happen. And in fact, the two big blows of demonetization and GST dramatically changed that relation, which is to say that the informal sector was much more adversely hit. So many of us had argued that, in fact, using the MCA as the basis for all of your industrial output calculations is problematic, and that you should really be looking at other indicators. Now, this is now confirmed by this rather careful analysis of Mr. Subramanian, which is basically saying that if you look at all these other indicators and you do regressions across countries or across time, you find that there is a match between various other indicators and our GDP data until 2011-12, and then there is no match. And that, I think, suggests that there is a big problem in the way that we have actually chosen to use this new series. These are problems that have been raised certainly by Professor Nagraj, who was a member of one of the expert committees, and by a number of other economists. So this is no surprise to many of us.
In fact, I want to just bring in, Santosh Mehrotra here. Professor Mehrotra, here's a question. We've been on several conversations on this very channel where government representatives have issued denial after denial after denial that there is anything wrong with the economy at all. Now, we understand that this was largely being done because there was an election in the country. But did that cost us dearly? Did we lose precious time?
Well, we are likely to have it. And I think what is also tragic is that in the interim, the NSSO has revealed the data about employment, and I've already begun analyzing that, and I think the situation is even grimmer than was told to us by the leaked data, because what we now know is that youth unemployment rates are much greater. We also know that manufacturing employment has actually fallen in absolute terms, which is in a sense what Professor Ghosh was referring to, the impact of the demonetization and the GST would have been quite significant. And it's also the case that construction jobs have not grown, and that's not surprising because construction investment, which is effectively driven by infrastructure investment, has not been growing. So all of this is pointing towards grimmer news, and all the analysis that will now emerge and has already been there on employment is totally consistent with Arvind Subramanian's analysis, because we have, a lot of us have been saying that the growth data is less than credible, and I think the Sudipta Mandal committee had already hinted at this.
Yes, I also want to ask Professor Nagraj. Professor Nagraj, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. We have a question from Priya Pandey, who said, why should we believe some non-government person's testimony? I do believe she's referring to Arvind Subramanian here. Arvind Subramanian is currently non-government, but he was government for a very large period of time. Are you inclined to believe or to agree with Mr. Subramanian's paper, or with this Mr. Subramanian who was with the government and saying everything was fantastic?
No, I agree with Dr. Subramanian's paper. And I think, as somebody asked, who is he? I think he's a very distinguished economist and professor at Harvard University. So I think, and he's done a fairly objective analysis, though one may, as professionals, we may disagree about the specific numbers, 4.5 or 4.7, but there's no doubt that the overall decline in growth rate is consistent with many many of us who have and of the output are quite consistent. As any macroeconomist will tell you, employment and output are two sides of the same coin, and both show a definite decline. So I think we are definitely in a very dire state. Employment numbers are really grim. So I think the economic situation is pretty bad. So it's to deny that Dr. Subramanian's work is done outside the country, or he's not in he's done it outside of the government. I think that's a wrong way of criticizing. We must look at what he has said and how carefully he has done. To me, my reading shows that he has done a fairly competent economic work, though one may quibble about details. But I think that is something we should take and look at ourselves, what we have done wrong during the last 3 or 5 years, which has brought us to the situation.
Yes. In fact, I'll come back to you, Professor Nagaraj. We have to just get your audio fixed. Professor Arun Kumar is also with us. And here's a question that's come in, and I'll ask as many questions as I can from my audience. What Venkat Swaroop says, what exactly went wrong that our entire economy has collapsed so badly, so suddenly? First of all, Professor Kumar, is it a sudden collapse? And how could it have happened, all of a sudden? What happened? What went wrong?
Okay, so let's look at what the paper says. The paper says that with the new base year of 2011-12, the rate of growth is less than what the data is suggesting. And there have been several controversies about the change of base and the new data that has come up. First a back series was not there, then a back series was created, and that showed that the growth during the UPA years was higher than growth during the NDA years. That wasn't acceptable to the government. Then they came up with another back series, where they showed that the NDA was growing faster than the UPA. And you can do this always because underlying any GDP calculation there are assumptions. So you can change the assumptions. So for instance, during the NDA period, you could show that the rate of growth of services sector is higher. You can change the inflation index by which you deflate the nominal growth, and you can play around, to show all this. So that was the second controversy. The third controversy is that the MCA 21 database, which has been used after 2011-12, there are missing companies, and that means that the blowing up factor with which Professor Nagaraj is very well versed, and he has actually objected to that earlier. That became a third controversy. This is now a fourth controversy, and this is here data going up to 2016-17, just the year when demonetization was introduced. That led to a sharp decline in the economy, but the new series shows that led to the highest rate of growth of 8.2%. And therefore, a lot of people began to doubt that that's what was happening. So post the demonetization, the rate of growth of the economy has slipped. What Mr. Subramaniam's data is showing is the average of the period between 2011 to 2016-17, it was 4.5 and not 7%. If you look at the data post the 2016-17, when demonetization took place, GST took place, then the rate of growth probably will turn out to be even lower. So in a sense, what has happened is that this government has induced shocks in the economy, which have led to a decline in the rate of growth, whether we go by the old series or by the new series or by the series that Mr. Arvind Subramanian has created. So the rate of growth has really plummeted after the demonetization because of the shock to the economy, which affected the unorganized sector. And unorganized sector employs 94% of the workforce, produces 45% of the output. So if you hit that larger sector, then that has an impact back on the organized sector. Yes. And now what you're seeing is that the impact on the organized sector is also being felt, and therefore the rate of growth of the organized sector is also declining. And now the latest quarter shows it has declined to 5.8%. And as you said in your opening remarks, automobile sales, commercial vehicle sales, two-wheeler sales, FMCG sales, they've all declined. So in a sense, what has happened is that whereas the UPA one, the shock came from outside where the oil prices rose. In the NDA period, what has happened is shock has come from within the government's policy paradigm, where we had the demonetization, then we had GST, and now the NBFCs, which are collapsing, and a lot of the loan for the unorganized sector comes from the NBFCs, So therefore, three shocks have come one after the other, which has led to the decline in the economy.
Manisha Priyam is with us right now. Ms. Priyam, good evening. Thank you for joining us. Manisha ji is a political analyst. The couple of the questions that I'm getting right now about Arvind Subramanian, we must remember that while he was with the government, Ms. Priyam, he vehemently defended the economy. He then resigned quite suddenly and said that he wanted some personal time. And now, just after the elections, he's put out this paper. Is there anything to be read into the timing of all of this?
See, the timing of a paper is not a major momentous occasion. The big timing is that of the elections. And much of this, whether Mr. Arvind Subramanian was inside or outside, much of this was felt, perceived, known, critiqued. The economy had slowed down. There were every indicators, index of industrial production, etc. On the jobs front, enough has been said after demonetization. But I think the bigger timing is the elections. And the huge message that's coming down, I'm going down to field areas in Indian states. I've been to Karnataka, I've been to Bihar, going to Uttar Pradesh. It seems following the elections, it's quite clear that people have put these issues aside. And the bigger political message, therefore, is that yes, slow down, so what? Yes, joblessness, so what? Yes, surely, the government has right now got a new script on which it can write. The government will form its committees, and the clear message now that can be drawn is that the best arguments we can put forward is, given the fact that there is jobless growth staring at us, given the fact that there is almost very little growth in manufacturing, especially in areas where the demographic dividend is, where we will see all that, we can argue whether the government is taking enough policy steps from now on or not. This vote, more than any other, has given the government a clean slate, a fresh slate. All the critique that we had of slow economic growth rates or of joblessness, etc., or even of demonetization and the informal sector or being disadvantaged or the poor being left out, that's something that is completely behind us. When I talk to the poor, they talk about the Jan Dhan accounts, they talk about the Swachhata grants, they talk about the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. Clearly, this is not headline item for them. So we need to see how we write a script which is very important for us. Ultimately, jobs are very important for us. Economic growth is very important for us. But something on which elections are no longer going to be won or lost, that's the bigger political message. So what do you do about this?
Right. Shweta Shalini of the BJP was listening very carefully. Ms. Shalini, the elections are now over, and you know, it's time to set aside the politics and focus on the fact that we have serious problems that can no longer be denied. Is the government now willing to accept that we do have a job crisis? We do have a manufacturing crisis, an investment crisis, an NBFC crisis. The banking sector and the NBFC sector are in dire states. Is there a willingness now to accept that and start fixing the problems?
Great, Faye. So as usual, I get to speak towards the end in your show. But nonetheless, I want you to remember that when I used to have debates with you on the topic of GDP before the elections, and I used to quote these car sales number and the data of people flying on the airlines, you and the entire panel would grant this as rubbish. And today, you're quoting those numbers. Now, coming back to three main things, I think beyond everything else, there are three things that you and your entire panel need to note. First, the GST collections have been increasing. Second, the taxpayers, the numbers and the volume has been continuously increasing. And third, and the most important thing is that the share market that reflects businesses is on an all-time high. So, considering this and having said this, we cannot close our eyes, and we would not want to close our eyes. There are two things that we have to admit. One, let me talk about the paper first. With due regards, there is this man who was talking a different language a few months ago and is talking a different language now. I would not want to comment because the report that he's talking about from 2011 to 2017, between which he was part of the government and the government changed the complete methodology. He is going back to the old methodology and comparing a new methodology and an old methodology and giving his report on that. I don't think that we can consider that. But yes, we need to understand that the GDP in the last quarter has dipped and we understand this. But what we all need to understand, and especially mediums like you need to understand, you've been using words like collapse completely, economic collapse. We need to understand that there is this US-China crisis which is going on, and we as Indians, as the country, are only going to benefit from factors and external factors like this. Having said this, that in the previous regime, we did some fundamental things like implementation of GST, demonetization, which are now basics and is set. Our methodology of addressing and measuring the economy are set. Yes, the last quarter was a problem, and we understand this. And I personally feel that it was a problem because the country was going through general elections. People were waiting to see if the government returns. There was no public spending which was happening, and hence people were just holding their money and no spend was actually happening. Now, the country has proven that there is a stable government at the center. Businesses are now, FDI are now confident that this stability is going to only increase the spend and the investment that is going to happen in the country. And hence, we feel that if we work systematically and together, I see we are going to definitely see good days ahead. I want to finish by telling your political analyst, Manisha ji, that we are a proud democracy. We've gone through elections. The people have selected the government on the narrative that they want to. Please do not disrespect the people of this country, and do not feel that the people of this country are less intelligent, because they're extremely intelligent. It is their right to choose the government that they want.
All right. So I want a clarification from you before I go to the rest of the panel to rebut your points. Ms. Shalini, you did mention demonetization. Just a yes or no answer would suffice. Is the BJP convinced that demonetization was a good thing?
See, it's not about BJP being convinced or not. We underwent, the entire country underwent the process of demonetization, and based on that, we went to the people to ask for votes, and you see the result. So,
so demonetization won you an election, obviously, but did you believe that, do you believe that it was good for the economy, was my question.
While he was in the government.
Do you believe it was good for the economy? It won you an election, but do you believe it was good for the economy?
Faye, please understand. Faye, see, please understand, I am a simple engineer. I am not an economist.
Okay, so let me ask the economist then. All right, let's take that to the economist. No, so you said you're not an economist. I want to go to the economists on this matter then. I just want to go over the rebuttals. Ms. Shalini, if you don't have an answer, that's fine. I will move on.
I feel that the country is going to see some great time ahead.
Okay. So, just to clarify a couple of the things that Ms. Shalini brought up, she did accuse me of asking her to speak last. I just want to point out the idea behind that is that she hears all of the arguments made by the other members of the panel and she's able to rebut them. It's something that would be difficult to do if she spoke first. Secondly, she did talk about the fact that GST tax collections have gone up. I want to point out that for 2018-19, tax collections are actually short of their target by 82,000 crore rupees, and that is not a small number. Her other arguments were that the number of taxpayers have increased, the share market is at an all-time high, that demonetization and general elections has reduced spending. Rebuttals from the panel. I'll go to Jayati Ghosh first. Ms. Ghosh, go ahead.
You know, I think what's of greatest concern to me is this whole ostrich-like attitude. I could understand before the elections that you want to pretend that everything is fine. But, you know, if you don't even recognize a problem, how are you going to address it? How can you keep saying, oh, the share market is high and things like this, when you're not even recognizing the fact that employment rates are down? It's not just that unemployment rates are high, but they are high in a context where overall labor force participation is falling, where employment rates are falling in an economy that is supposedly growing, where you are having deep distress, not just in informal activity, but now clearly in agriculture, in a large part of small industry, and now increasingly even in large industry. If you don't take these problems seriously, you're not going to be able to resolve them. The NBFC issue is something that also, in a sense, has its roots in demonetization. The inability of the banking sector to actually cope with all of that burden, the collapse in credit, the very large NPAs that were being held, etc., actually made the government encourage the expansion of NBFCs in an irresponsible way. And that led to an NBFC bubble, which has now burst, and that is coming home to roost. Now, these are all problems that require urgent actions. They don't require someone to say, well, you know, it's not really a problem, and look, people love us anyway. That's not the issue. The issue now is that we have an economy that is slowing down, where there is massive open unemployment and very significant declines in employment rates, which means we do not get any advantage from the demographic dividend. We have a young population that is unable to find jobs. We have deep-seated agrarian distress. We have falling investment rates. We have manufacturing in a slump. These are independent of the politics. These are independent of whether people voted for you or not. These require economic policy solutions, and it doesn't help to simply say that, look, I mean, the elections showed that people love us. That's not the point. The point is, what are you planning to do about it? Particularly, what are you planning to do to revive demand? Because that is one of the essential reasons why we're seeing all the slump around us. What are the specific actions that the government intends to do to revive demand in the economy?
Yes, and I just want to bring in Professor Nagaraj. Professor Nagaraj, a lot of our viewers are asking us this question of whether or not the share market or the stock market being where it is right now is an indicator of anything. And also people want to know, is it true that people stop spending money because of the election, and that's the reason why demand is down? Professor Nagaraj.
I don't think stock market is any indicator of the real economy. As in macroeconomics, we often say, even in the US, stock market is a sideshow, not the real show. The real show depends upon saving, investment, and growth. And stock market, honestly, fuels very little of actual capital formation, which leads to output and growth. Okay, so stock market hardly tells us anything, especially in India today, where stock market is mostly driven by FIIs, because it's basically foreign money. So they come in when it is convenient for them, and they leave when it is convenient for them. Therefore, it hardly affects the real economy. Even in terms of savings, percentage of households in India which invest in stock market is a very small percentage. So I don't think stock market can be seriously taken as an indicator of economic well-being in India. Okay. About the other question, yes, I think there has been a steady deceleration of quarterly growth rates. To say that government was not spending money just during the last quarter and therefore the GDP fell, I think that's completely fallacious. Quarterly GDP has been falling for last 5 or 6 quarters. And in fact, last quarter, government spending went up because government wanted to show that it is doing something. Public expenditure went up during last quarter because the government wanted to show that it's doing something for the people. So therefore, it is completely wrong to say that the last quarter was affected by elections. It is affected by lack of demand from investment and consumers. I mean, the fall of car sales, scooter sales has been happening over several quarters. Okay, so therefore, I don't think I agree with that analysis at all, because that is not based on facts.
Well, the other question that I do want to ask at this point is this: will the global investing community be spooked by the fact that we got another question now on our GDP numbers and the fact that we're seeing what can only be described as a structural slowdown? Professor Kumar, if you want to take that question, will this spook our global investors, all of the money that we're hoping investors will bring in?
So, you know, Faye, you're right. It will spook not only global investors, but Indian investors as well. Because if the GDP data is incorrect and your employment data government says is not very accurate, then, you know, there's a twin problem. You know, when you have a policy making like the budget making, In the budget, you require the GDP numbers to actually see how the expenditures will go and how the revenues will go. So if your GDP numbers have been wrong, then your data on revenue collection and expenditures, those will turn out to be incorrect. Therefore, your deficit will turn out to be incorrect. Similarly, the RBI fixes it does inflation targeting, and it also fixes the interest rate to see that the growth, is revived. Now, both of these go wrong if your data is wrong. So in other words, if your data on GDP is wrong, then a lot of policy parameters, they go wrong, and therefore your policy design goes wrong. And that's what you've been seeing. So for instance, GST collection, as you rightly pointed out, was short by about 80,000 crores last year. And this year it's running way behind target. And that's why the GST, body is saying that we have to lower the target in the budget, for the amount of GST collection. Similarly, the direct tax collection has not been as robust as was expected, and therefore those targets also are going to be coming down. Now, if the GDP numbers are wrong, then both these are expected, apart from the fact that the employment figures will be down. Now, going to the international bodies, they also are looking at what is the rate of growth, because that determines the profitability of the investment in the economy. Now, if the GDP numbers turn out to be much lower than what was being given out, then what investment they're bringing in or what they expect to bring in, both of those will be revised downward. And I'd like to point out that FDI is only 5% of the total investment in the economy. So it's not so much that the FDI will affect it, but what is happening is that because of the trade war between US and China and US and Europe, the Eurozone problem with Brexit, and the American government, increasing tariffs on Indian goods, the GSP being withdrawn, all this is going to affect our exports. And once exports get affected, that again rebounds back on our GDP
you're painting a very grim picture, Professor Kumar. I want to go back to Manisha Priyam here.
Well, it's very unstable. It's very unstable. Yeah.
Yes. Manisha ji, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to what Shweta Shalini said, that your comment was actually offensive to the Indian voter and it's and our collective intelligence. But I also want you to comment on the fact that, to be able to measure the success or to measure the success of any policy decision by winning an election is perhaps not right. Because while demonetization may have won several elections for the BJP, that doesn't make it a healthy economic decision. Ms. Priyam.
So I'll respond to two of the things said by earlier speakers, esteemed Sri Nagaraj ji and Professor Kumar. When Nagaraj ji was speaking about the investments mainly coming to the stock exchange through the F2Is, now once again I'd like to apprise those who are looking at the show that in the fieldwork just completed in Bangalore, the tech sector workers, the first generation voters that the BJP talks about so much today, they feel quite enthused and they see this, irrespective, you can keep arguing and telling them that look, stock market investment can fly off. It's not something that is stably made in an institutional sort of way and may not be locked into your economy. But they see this as a measure of confidence building, and they see this as a possibility that more and more global economic decisions can be taken. So that's the mood of the electorate with respect to increases in F2Is. So it may not be sound economics, but as far as popular backing is concerned, this is seen as a very popular thing that's happening. So there is today an understanding of economic growth rates. Even if the figures are low, if the money is coming into the stock exchange through F2Is, this generation is very happy with it. And as long as Mr. Modi is seen as steering India's global decision making at investment tables where it can rise up to a China, even if not compete with it, then the electorate back home is quite happy with it. It's very clear. Now, the second point about the when Professor Arun Kumarji was speaking, that last point that he's made about the investment rates, etc. Yes, the outside investor is looking at our growth rates to make these investments. But if Professor Kumar may kindly look at the fact that the World Bank and the IMF have been optimistic about growth rates for India. So whether they are going to be using the actual growth rates or their own forecasts of optimism. So while we may have a pessimistic outlook portrayed looking at the current numbers being put out by Arvind Subramanian, the growth forecasts made there seem to be very optimistic. Now, there is another line there, which is that India is no longer borrowing on soft terms because we are no longer in the bottommost category, and we are like an emerging market that is kind of growing into the middle income group. So we may have to borrow on higher rates. So why an optimistic picture is being painted? There may be reasons behind it, but at this point of time, what has happened is that on the GDP now, we have numbers, we have many debates now. We have Arvind Subramanian saying that yes, this was high in the past, but this may be a corrected figure. In the international arena, certain very credible agencies painting an optimistic picture. So what will happen therefore is that on the GDP numbers also, the government can stay on the sidelines and be quiet and let this debate overtake what the real picture is. The government itself is not going to contradict any of these. Yes, of course, the bigger thing will be that tax collections may fall down, and the real reasons why this government has won, Faye, are some of its schemes such as the Swachh Bharat Yojana, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, the Jan Dhan Yojana, the Ujjwala scheme, and all of these require the government's revenue capacities with a lot of headroom there, and the government needs to be a revenue generating economy. So that's where the crunch lies. So today, they may win the political argument, but to keep on with the schemes that have brought them back to power, they will need the money, and that's where the question is going to be tough on them. Now, I'd like to, I have nothing to say, because at no point of time have I looked at the consciousness of India's voters or anything with the kind of words that the esteemed panelist has used. It is her interpretation. She may be using these words for voters in India. I don't do this because my job in my profession is to go back and understand why people vote the way they do, what are their civic or political motivations. So it is on this show. I have not used any of such words. Why she wants to use these words is for her to understand, and let her do it. I don't want to engage with it at all. At this point of time, I'd like to focus simply on the fact that the popular mood of the electorate that has voted with a very thumping majority for Mr. Modi is very different on many of these matters than what the established economic wisdom is, and that debate is going to continue.
All right, so let me open that up. It's a very fair point. Very fair point. Let me open this up.
Seasoned understanding is going to different from the voters.
Let me open this up for rebuttals. Anyone who wants to make a rebuttal, please raise your hand. Professor Kumar is already has his hand up. Professor Kumar, go ahead.
So, when we say that the World Bank is endorsing the rate of growth of the Indian government, the World Bank doesn't collect independent data. IMF doesn't collect independent data. So they really go by actually tweaking the government's own data. So in a sense, that's not an independent data, and therefore we shouldn't say that because the World Bank is saying the rate of growth is 7%, therefore it's an endorsement of the government data. It's like, sort of mutually patting each other's back. The second point is that the economic perceptions and political perceptions can be very different. You can have an economic downturn and get the politics may, be based on, say, other factors. We know what other factors may be there underlying, that. So, in other words, saying that somebody's won an election doesn't necessarily mean that the economy is doing well. And now the hard fact of the economy not doing so well will come, and the government will have to tackle that. So in other words, yes, the political mandate is there, but the political mandate is for the politics.
But actually, the political mandate. But the political mandate actually is very beautiful at this point, because it gives this government a clean 5 years with almost no opposition whatsoever to make all of the difficult decisions that need to be taken at this point to make change. So this perhaps could actually be a very a long honeymoon period that can be used by the government to make tough decisions or to take tough decisions. Professor Mehrotra, we could continue to argue that, because an election was won, the government, that everything is well. Instead, shouldn't we be arguing that because an election is won, let's quickly get on this and solve the problems that are staring us in the face?
Can I come in, Faye?
Well, we can only hope so. But if we don't...
Faye, can I come in?
But if we don't
Professor Mehrotra
actually
first,
recognize the problem, as other panelists have said, I don't see how this is going to be addressed. But ultimately, Faye, we have to recognize that if growth is nowhere close to what is being claimed, but is closer to what Arvind Subramanian is claiming, then the revenues will tend to stabilize, they will tend to fall off, and all the plans that the government may have of increasing spending on Awas Yojana, on toilets, on Ayushman Bharat, on health services, on implementing the new education policy, and above all on infrastructure investment, which has taken us a massive hit, will not happen. So, far from being able to compete with China, China is still growing at 6% plus per annum. And we have to remember that they were growing at 9 to 10% per annum for a 30-year period for them to have reduced poverty to an unprecedented level. So we have never in our history managed to get anywhere close to 9%, 10% per annum, but for a very limited period. And if anything, simply to look at what has happened to the stock market is only telling you the following, that increasingly over the last few years, it is not foreign institutional investment which is driving the stock exchange, it is the domestic investors, the retail investors. And why are domestic retail investors increasingly putting money into the stock exchange? It is because earlier people used to invest in houses. Well, housing and construction is not growing. The construction industry is in the doldrums. And companies which were supposed to deliver houses are not being able to deliver houses. So if incomes and wages are not growing, people are not demanding money. If anyone has savings, then they put it into the stock exchange. That's an important reason why the stock exchange is growing.
Okay.
What is happening to the stock exchange has precious little to do. Precious little to do what the real state of the economy is. And yes, the young in Bangalore may be feeling very upbeat, but the young in the whole country also are also feeling the following, that in 2011-12, for graduates, the open unemployment rate was 19%. Today, it's 36%. For postgraduates, it was 21%. It is now 36%. And those with a technical degree in 2011-12, it was 18%. It is double that. So the young are also feeling that. The two are coexisting.
Okay, so let me just, I know that Shweta Shalini wanted to respond. Ms. Shalini, go ahead, respond.
Yes, very, very quickly, I think I'll pick up one by one. Faye, I need to tell you, I think this is the only government which took tough decisions even before the elections. And you know this, you're a witness to this. There were people who were saying that anybody who could take a call of GST will go out of power. We have taken tough decisions and we will take tough decisions here on also, whatever is right for the country, and everyone must believe this. I also want to respond to other panelists. I think Nagaraj ji said that he has a disbelief that the last quarter public spending was less. I need to remind him that the last quarter that we are talking about, there is a moral code of conduct, and hence the government cannot spend money. So we need to check our facts before we go and pelt it out and disregard any basic theory. And there are a lot of people listening to you, so we need to understand
hang on.
spending was down
Shweta Shalini, nobody said that the government must spend during the model code of conduct.
Both of them have said, Faye, you need to let me finish, please.
Yeah, but if you're not going to, if you're going to misunderstand and you're going to misquote my panelists, I have to correct you.
Contradictory things. One says that it is only the indigenized Indian people who are investing into the stock market today, and Ms. Ghosh is saying that it's only the FDI which is basically reflecting in the stock market today. One thing or two things that have been left to say. One, is about the banks and the NPAs. We know that for years together there have been NPAs. The bank interests are coming down. I think we will see, and there is course correction happening. We do not close our eyes to changing times, and we will do course correction. We are doing course correction. You are seeing that interest rates are down. I think there will be one more year of pain that the country will see, but this is for good and for effective regain of the economy.
Second, okay, all right. Let me just, okay, hang on. Are you done?
Been talking about for quite some time. I think one of the things that we have not considered is the informal employment that we needed to consider, and hence there was a methodology of change in recording this employment data also, and hence we have been saying time and again that we have built toilets, we have built Awas Yojanas, we have built roads, and they are for people to see. There are people who have constructed these roads, and these have been employed. But unfortunately,
so in that case, then it's not informal employment.
They have increased the amount that Uber driver, taxi drivers earn under Uber has increased. Now there is a need for us to go from
Shalini, I'm going to stop you there, because now the arguments you're making are just not making any sense. I just told you that commercial vehicle sales have dropped. This basically would suggest that there aren't commercial vehicles being sold, that passenger cars are not being sold. Now, before you interrupt me, we know full well that there have actually been protests in most of our cities by Ola and Uber drivers who say they're not making enough money to break even anymore. You've made other arguments as well that I'm going to now hand over to the panel to actually argue. But I just want to point out, to suggest that any of my panelists argued that government should spend during the Model Code of Conduct was ridiculous. They said because of a lack of spending, we're seeing an impact. The two things are different. It was not a blame. It was a cause and effect. Ms. Jayati Ghosh, go ahead.
Yeah, first I just want to, this constantly made this argument that our earlier survey data or the current labor force survey data do not capture informal employment. That's absolute nonsense. In fact, these are surveys specifically designed to capture informal employment, including Uber and Ola, including all kinds of informal activity. So this notion that these surveys are only looking at formal or organized sector is completely false. The point about these labor force surveys, what is so frightening, is that even informal employment, especially informal employment after the demonetization and GST, has suffered very, very badly. For every new additional Ola driver, there are people who have been actually thrown out of employment. There are people who have lost their jobs, and there are young people who are not getting jobs. That's the big concern. I think that's the first point. The second is that, we really have to stop constantly being so politicizing about the economy and the data. These are not things, that depend on this party or that party. I have been as critical of the UPA in terms of many of the economic policies. To see everything in terms of which party is in power is not just counterproductive. It's actually deeply terrifying, because it means that this party in power is not willing to actually look at the problem and see what we can do about it. So I think we really have to stop politicizing the issue of what the economy, the situation of the economy is, because if we don't, we are never actually going to address it as we should.
Absolutely, very well said. I also want to point out that Shweta Shalini's arguments were we're building roads and we're building toilets and people are getting employment through that, but it's this unofficial employment that cannot be measured. But if the government is giving that employment through your own projects, you should be able to measure that. Also, I want to point out, and we've said this over and over again.
It is measured.
It is measured
in the surveys.
That all of the data, especially the data of the NSSO,
is being measured.
Surveys do capture these things.
Is being done through a survey where
that is precisely what I said, that these are being, this is the employment which is getting generated.
Capture that kind of employment.
So now if you are agreeing and your panelists agreed that there are roads being constructed,
that's the nature of a household
and I think Manisha ji pointed this out, that there are
okay, one second. Let me just ask Shweta Shalini this question. Ms. Shalini, I have a question for you.
People being employed.
Ms. Shalini, take a deep breath. I have a question for you.
Yes,
do you believe we have an unemployment? Just one second, if I may. Shweta Shalini, do you believe we have a problem with unemployment right now in our country? Yes or no?
Faye, again and again, see, please do not push words into my mouth. I have said this again, and I'm saying this again. I'm not an economist, so I'm not the right person to tell you
So what have you been doing for the last
and there is nothing
47
that I
minutes?
need to believe. I believe I am an entrepreneur, and I believe that the number of people who are skilled is increasing. The number of entrepreneurs, the number of startups, the women who
so
are
if you
taking
don't
loans
believe
and are
we have a
self-employed are
crisis,
increasing.
why has the government
The
set
rate
up
of
an
return of
empowered
interest,
group of ministers or an
in self-help
EGOM?
groups, and the women who are coming together as self-help groups are increasing? These are the numbers which have not been captured anywhere, and hence I need to tell you, and this is what
I'm just going to finally, I'm going to say this one more time, and I'm going to say it very slowly. Ms. Shalini is obviously not even listening at this point. But in conclusion, while I thank my panelists, let me just put this out there. The argument that any kind of employment is not being measured is completely and utterly and totally and provenly false. Because the data that is put out by the NSSO, which is the government's own arm and it has been for the last 40 odd years, is a survey data where they go into households and they ask everybody in that household, what do you do, what do you do, what do you do, what do you do, where do you work, how much do you earn, how many days of the month are you working on an average, what do you get paid, and all of that is registered. So unless someone refuses perhaps to live in a house, and they choose to live in trees and they're not being surveyed, every kind of employment is being surveyed. Also, our sample survey, the size of the number of people that we go and speak to, is among the largest in the world. So even if there is someone stitching petticoats in their home, part-time, making 20 rupees a week, the NSSO survey will record it. Official or unofficial, making dabba, making pickle, everything gets recorded. So this argument that this is not being recorded and that is not being recorded is completely and utterly false. Somehow there is a break in communication. On one hand, you have people from the government who still refuse to accept that we have serious problems. All of the evidence points to the fact that we have problems. The good thing, though, is that the government has decided to reconstitute the EGOMs, or the empowered group of ministers that it dismantled when it first came into power in its first term. They've put together an empowered group of ministers on employment, on growth, and on various other important subjects, suggesting that the government realizes within the corridors of power at least that there is a problem and it needs to be fixed. All we ask at this point, all we ask is that we use the next 5 years and the rousing mandate that has been given to this government to make the decisions that need to be made to rescue our economy. And yes, I use the word rescue here because it needs rescuing. And if it does need rescuing, there's no one better placed to rescue than the current Modi government 2.0. Thanks for watching. Good night.